Welcome to the Disability Sport Info Show, the podcast that explores academic knowledge about disability sport. My name is Dr. Chris Brown, and I'm an academic with an expertise in disability sport. Each episode, I focus on a specific topic of disability sport and speak to academic experts to understand the area in more depth. So, join me and listen to the Disability Sport Info Show to get an expert view on disability sport. In this episode, we'll consider what difference the Paralympic Games can have on disabled people. We'll discuss the concept of sport participation legacies and critically appraise the empowerment potential of the Games. We begin with a discussion on sport participation legacies from the Paralympic Games. I consider what we mean by legacy and consider how the Paralympic Games might or might not be able to influence sport participation. I spoke to Professor Laura Meisner, an expert in the field of Paralympic legacies. Laura, welcome to the show and thanks for joining me today to discuss Paralympic legacies. In the build-up to a mega sport event and after amazing sporting exploits, there's often the belief that the event or sporting achievements from the athletes will serve to inspire some people to take up sport. This is often framed as being a legacy from the event. Claims of legacies from mega sport events are common, but what do we mean by legacy in a Paralympic context?
Sure, I'm happy to chat about Paralympic legacies. Legacy is an interesting concept because it's a bit nebulous in many respects. People use it for anything and everything that comes after the event or it has been created or impacted by hosting a mega event. So it is a bit of a catch-all term. But the reality is what we really mean by legacy is anything that is directly created as a result of hosting the event. So often we think about that in terms of large infrastructure, such as stadia or venues that we have to build in order to host a large game, such as the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And in relation then to Paralympic legacies, the piece that's really important to consider is the ways in which that supports more individuals with disabilities becoming more involved in participation in sport in all realms of life. So creating infrastructure such as those venues that become fully accessible where they may not have been accessible previously, creating public transportation that actually connects individuals to those particular infrastructures in order to create an accessible network so that you can actually participate. And then, of course, there are things beyond the physical structures and the concept of social legacy. So the idea that it will change our understanding or our feelings about participating in sport, for example. And around the Paralympic legacy piece, there's quite a bit that's associated with the idea that it will change our perceptions and understanding of disability and our awareness about issues of disability. And so the games are often touted as an example of the way that we can think differently, see and view disability differently, and maybe understand disability differently and more positively in our everyday life. Those are sort of the common assumptions that are considered to be legacy. The challenge, of course, is really understanding and measuring any of those to see if they actually do create any of this legacy.
Really interesting insights and lots of topics that have been covered in your answer there. This brings us to the idea of measuring legacy. Legacy seems to be an all-encompassing concept. So how do we go about measuring legacies from the Paralympic Games? Are there any insights from the literature on how we can do this?
Well, a lot of scholars have tried to measure different legacies. And there's been arguments made that you can't really measure legacy in the direct aftermath of a games. That's not actually the legacy. The legacy is something that comes in the long term. So, the 5 to 10 years, even longer than that range after the games. That's really the true measure of legacy. At least that's what scholars have argued for a long time. The problem, of course, is many of us aren't around for that amount of time. It takes a lot to actually do those kinds of studies that are extremely longitudinal. So studying Paralympic legacy from that longitudinal perspective is challenging, and there are almost no studies that do that actually look at that a longitudinal long-term legacy. A few studies have examined some more direct impacts post-game. So for example, looking at, has it changed individuals' attitudes towards disability in the direct aftermath of the games? So I was involved in a study with some colleagues. We looked at the Commonwealth Games as an example of how does this potentially impact individuals' attitudes. And what we really found is, in fact, the games didn't have much of an impact on people's perceptions and understanding of disability, partly because those who typically come to watch the event or are involved in the event already have pretty positive attitudes, already have a really generally good understanding and insights about disability. So it's not necessarily impacting the broader society in the way we want it to. And so that becomes the big challenge of measuring legacy, is because we need to ensure that there is intentionality. So something actually needs to be set out in advance of the games, plan to do something to create these impacts and to create these long-term outcomes in order for us to measure it. Otherwise, what we find is scholars measuring things that weren't really supposed to happen anyway, and are just hoping that maybe something did happen, or maybe the organizers said, oh, this might be a great outcome. Maybe lots of people will get involved in participating in sport. That's a great one that event organizers like to say. Everybody's going to get up and start getting active once they watch the games. And the reality is that just doesn't happen. There's maybe a small inspiration, particularly in the Paralympic space, where typically we don't see individuals with disability on TV or broadcast in that way. So it may have a small inspiration effect, but it doesn't have a big long-term participation impact in the way that event organizers and politicians might suggest that it does. And so those are the big pieces, is actually measuring legacy is very, very challenging.
I'm really interested in this notion that a mega event such as the Olympic Games or the Paralympic Games may not be able to provide sustainable, regular sports participation. We often hear claims from governments and host organisers that, yes, this mega event will be able to inspire people to be active, to participate in more sport. But if we've got evidence to the contrary, why does this idea, this belief that a mega event will provide regular participation persist? For our listeners, are you able to explain why mega events maybe aren't the best way of increasing regular participation amongst the population?
Right. I mean, that's $1 million question in some respects. And why doesn't it create participation? And why do we not see the effects that event organizers claim it to be? I think if an event in and of itself, I mean, to put it in really simplistic terms in a nutshell, if an event was the magic pill that could fix the inactivity problem, then we'd be set, right? We'd host a big event and everybody would get up and start active. But I mean, we understand very well theories of behavior change, that behavior change takes a long time and more than one singular process or event in order to change people's behavior. So if people aren't already active, just seeing others active is not likely to inspire them to be active. In fact, we have seen studies that have shown the opposite, because in fact, it that gets individuals realizing, well, I actually probably can never achieve that. So why do I start? Why would I even start? So it actually goes counterintuitive to our understandings of what we know about behavior change. And interestingly, we have even seen some research where we might see what might look like an impact on participation from the games, and particularly Paralympic Games. But what those studies have found is that it's getting people who are already active to try new things. So they might be switched to another sport. Maybe they see something in the games they didn't know existed. And that's a really big piece about Paralympic Games, is that, somebody might see something they didn't know was available to them. And so that active person might then switch to another sport. And so that's where sometimes organizers and those in the sports sector might say it does have an impact. it may have an impact in shifting people to different sports, maybe encouraging some people to go towards a high performance perspective. But overall, it's not changing the behavior of average everyday citizens to say, I want to get up and start moving and participating. To change behavior takes a lot more than that. It's not just simply showing somebody what's out there and available. We need to be able to lead people in order to get people more active. So there needs to be an activation on top of that event if we actually expect to see any changes in behavior.
I think we can make a distinction between those who are already participating in sport, who may increase their frequency or engage in activity switching, and those who are new to sport participation. So when we hear claims about more people participating in sport, we have to question whether these claims are about already active individuals participating in more sport, or whether we're referring to new people participating in sport. It sounds like getting new people to participate in sport is harder. So it's the non-active individuals who we really want to take up sport from a health and social perspective, but that's harder to achieve using a mega sport event, it sounds like.
Yeah, because to change people's behavior, I mean, I work in a school of kinesiology, and my colleagues are from all disciplines in kinesiology. So from sport management, psychologists, exercise physiologists, and this is what we study, is getting people to actually be active and change behavior. And so just an event in of itself is not enough. The one value I think that's really important that we do need to remember, though, in the Paralympic Games or events that demonstrate and show disability sport is at the very least it shows people what is available and what the options are, where we don't see that on a regular basis. That's not visible to us. I don't think a lot of people knew or understood things about how bocce, for example, is played, or that is a sport that is available to individuals with severe levels of impairment, severe levels of cerebral palsy. I know that's not something that is known and well understood. So the games create an opportunity to showcase those things and show people that there are these opportunities available to them. But it's really upon event organizers and the cities to do something about that if they want to get people active. Not just show it, you need to lead us to it and let us know how to get involved in that.
So you can't just wait for the event to engender change by itself. That's not going to be sufficient. You need to have supplementary programs and initiatives to encourage people to be active on a regular basis.
And essentially, that's the concept, and I know we're going to talk about it, the idea of leveraging, because that really moves us beyond just simply expecting the event to create the outcomes to using the event as a catalyst to create particular outcomes. So if we want people to be more active or involved in disability sport, this event itself is a great showcase to what's available. But now we then need to activate on that. So demonstrate to individuals, well, now that you've seen that, here's the local program that you can get involved in. And here's how you get involved. And come and try it out. Let's try a free day. Let's have a free pass to it. Bring a friend to it, so that we actually get people involved in trying those. And then from there, we can potentially build that sport participation in those opportunities. So leveraging is really about using the event as a catalyst and then strategically creating those opportunities to have those particular outcomes and impacts. And in this case, if we're talking about sport participation, it's making sure that clubs are ready, that organizations are ready, and they're doing something to actually welcome new individuals and new participants into their organizations.
You mentioned leveraging, so I think now is a good time to focus on this. Leveraging is quite a hot concept in the legacy literature for the reasons that you've mentioned. We know the event on its own is not going to be sufficient. If you want to get some participation benefits from the event, you need to have leveraging to complement the staging of the event. But what do we know about leveraging techniques? What do we know about organisations leveraging the event? Is leveraging a common practice? Does leveraging happen before the event? Does it happen after the event? What's your understanding of leveraging in the literature?
Right. So there's a little bit of a debate in the literature, and those of us who sit on one side of it would argue that there's a clear distinction between legacy, which is just an outcome of the event happening, something gets put in place, and the event organizers, the organizing committee moves on. Leveraging is about the capitalizing on event-related resources. So using whatever resources come in associated with the event, those things need to be tied to local initiatives. So ideally, it's not out of the blue something completely different, but it really fits and embedded within the policy structures existing within a local community. And that can then be something that is enduring and sustainable longer term after the event. So can it happen before, during, or after was one of your questions? And yeah, it can, because in fact, the catalytic effect of an event happens at each of those stages. It happens before, when you have this buildup and excitement of it coming, and there is new infrastructure being built, and you're recruiting volunteers. So you can use those opportunities to catalyze and create new things that might happen or might be embedded in the community, new volunteers, new participants, right? So you can use that. During the event, you have this celebration opportunity, and it's easy to capitalize on that celebration to create potential new outcomes that you might want to see. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the event, once the event is actually done, you have left with these legacy pieces, these resources, whether they be infrastructure, financial resources, human resources, in order to use those strategically to create particular outcomes, whether it be sport participation, whether it's to focus on new and accessible programming in the community, transportation. There's all kinds of different things that can be done to use those resources. So I would say, from a theoretical perspective, we know well, and we have good ideas about what can and should be done. But to be fair, we don't have a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that to support this, right? This is a good idea, and there are events that are doing it. And we have some evidence that shows how events or how communities and organizations have used an event to create new participants in a program or support a new facility to get new participants into that facility. But in reality, we don't have a lot of studies that actually demonstrate how this should be done. And one of the key issues is that we know an organizing committee is a short-term entity. They are there to organize an event, and then after the event is done, they're gone. So someone needs to be taking ownership over those leveraging initiatives that will be enduring beyond the games. So if we really want more people to get involved in disability sport, it needs to be living in a different space, those ideas, those leveraging activities. It can't just live with the organizing committee. And I think that's the big piece that's been a stopgap in the literature, is that people have studied events and organizing committees as being the central entity. But the reality is we know is that event in those organizing committees are fleeting. So we need to start to look towards what other organizations, what other groups could be capitalizing and leveraging those events. And I'm being a bit long-winded here, but I can give you one example of that. Is I've worked closely with a group in the province of Ontario that is a group of disability sport organizations and provincial sport organizations that came together around the 2015 Pan American Games. And the idea was to increase participation for individuals with disabilities in sport and physical activity. And so the event was the catalyst to create the bringing together of that group. But now we're talking 5 years out, and that group remains working together, continuing to create opportunities, continuing to capitalize on the resources that were brought in as a part of the 2015 games. And we have seen significant increases in programming opportunities, in participation opportunities for individuals with disabilities, capitalized on that and used that for coaching resources, increased para-coaching. So there is some instances of demonstrating how this is working, but I would say those instances are few and far between.
In terms of that particular example you've referred to, do we have data about the number of people participating? It seems there are resources available and knowledge may have increased, but in terms of converting people from being non-active to active, do we have the data to support the leveraging efforts that have gone on for that particular example?
So I might throw my own government under the bus here by saying this, but unlike unlike the UK where you are, or in Australia, we don't have very good broad-based statistical data related to participation numbers. So we actually don't have, even on our census data, we don't collect data about participation numbers. So we have very little information to know where the baseline was to begin with. So on one hand, it makes it really easy for politicians to say, we've increased participation. Look at all these new people participating, because they have no idea where we started from. So anybody participating suddenly looks like a great increase and we're doing a wonderful job. So we have struggled with really being able to sort of prove that numerically and to really sort of say, this is the actual increase in numbers. We have evidence from each of the partners that's involved in this collective to say, they tell us and they have shown us within their own programs where they've seen increased numbers, and they can tell us what those numbers are. But what we don't know is, are those sport switchers? So did they come from another sport and suddenly decide, well, now there's a new velodrome, so I'm going to take up cycling instead of, the swimming I was doing before? We don't know to the extent at which we're seeing that. Anecdotally from the partners, we are seeing many of them saying, yeah, we know these people. We've seen them around. It's not necessarily new. So because of that, what we actually have done recently is the partners have focused more on trying to get people into introductory programs through partnership opportunities. So bring a friend to the program, come for free for your first 5 sessions, and actually seeing some good uptake on that. Partnering with hospitals and therapy programs to get those who are maybe already in therapy or using physical activity as a therapeutic mechanism into participating outside of that space in a regular mechanism. So, and we're seeing some really good uptake on that. So that's a bit of a stay tuned, because I think what we will see is there is some opportunity of that. But overall, I would say the biggest piece for this group is the fact that they stayed together and they're working together. So the partnership is really the key legacy, and then they are capitalizing on that partnership.
I think this points to the issue of measurement we discussed earlier. You've got the issue of a lack of baseline data, and then trying to understand really granular detail about the nature of the participants. Are these new people to sport and physical activity? Are these already active individuals trying a new sport? We don't know, because the baseline data isn't sufficient to really give us those insights. So I think this highlights the point that you made earlier, that it is tricky to measure legacy.
Extremely difficult to measure legacy. And, on the one hand, we know governments, politicians in particular, want to see that numerical data. They want to see the numbers of how many people are participating. And then the other, there are those of us who are in the research realm who see, yes, that's important, but there are other pieces that are important. Like, what is the experience of participation? Because if we think about it, one of the great things that can happen as a legacy is the creation of, for example, accessible facilities. I talked about that at the outset. And for individuals with disability, that's a big piece. They may have been participating before, but maybe it wasn't in a venue that was really meeting their needs, or a program that was meeting their needs. And so that qualitative data has been really important. And we have collected some information on that. I'm going to put a plug in. We have a project ongoing right now. That is actually a website called Project Echo. And it is about asking people, what are their experiences in host cities, in previously host cities? So do they have better opportunities? Do they feel like they have better access? What is the experience that they're getting? Because that qualitative information is really quite critical to understanding legacy, not just the numbers. And so we can measure those things, but it comes back to politicians don't always want to hear that qualitative piece. Yes. They want the numbers.
Good plug. Do check it out. Project Echo. Really important project going on. Like you said, we do need qualitative evidence, those rich understandings of legacy that may not be highlighted in more quantitative studies. Well, it's clear to me from this discussion that leveraging is really important. And if we want to get any sport participation benefits from megasport events, leveraging must accompany the event itself. But do organisations leverage megasport events from what we know? What's your take on this, Laura? How common is leveraging?
It's not as common as we might think. And we go back to the central question of whose responsibility is it? So What we do know is that we think for sport participation, for example, it should reside with community sport organizations, local sport organizations. But we've done some research that has suggested that those organizations don't have the capacity or the ability really to activate in the way we might want them to. If we think about local community organizations, they're already stretched for resources, mostly acting, in the capacity of volunteers and limited volunteer support. So we've, even when we've tried to work with them to help them and support them leverage an event, it's been very, very challenging, and we haven't seen the outcome that we would have liked in order to support a leveraging effort. But there has been other studies that have shown even small leveraging activities. For example, a colleague of mine at the University of Waterloo, Luc Patorka, did some work around the 2015 Pan Am Games about giving out, free passes, just a singular free pass, come and try this new facility. And it had a really good impact on the uptake. So many people did then come and try the facility. And in doing so, those at the facilities then capitalize on that opportunity and then develop the program more. So there, some small things are happening. They might be happening more than we as researchers really know, because I don't know that the organizations and the groups doing them really see that as a big deal. Like, I think they just do it because, well, this is a great event, and why wouldn't we do something? How great. And so, in fact, it's getting and finding those things that are going on that are really important. And, the example that I talked about in the province of Ontario, I don't know that that's necessarily unique. I actually think there are more events that have partnership groups working together to leverage in some way. It's just that this is still a relatively new concept. So there isn't a lot of empirical evidence to support or understand how and why and in what mechanisms.
As an expert in the field, are you able to summarise the current state of knowledge in the Paralympic legacy literature? What do you think will be the most important aspect for future research in this area, do you think?
That's not a small question to end us off. It's a big question. It's interesting. A number of years ago, so colleagues of mine, and I think you've spoken to one of them, David Legg, was part of that. We did a study on the state of Paralympic legacies, and at that time, back in 2013, I think it was, I was astonished at the lack of research that was being done on Paralympic legacy, that we really knew almost nothing about what was happening related to legacy leveraging and the Paralympic Games. The things that we did know tended to be towards managerial implications. So, for example, the importance of how the Paralympic Games has helped develop and fuel disability sport governance and developing sport organizations more broadly and across the globe. But beyond that, we had very little understanding of what was happening with legacies related to the games. Fast forward almost, 8 years later, and it is pleasing to say we know a small bit more. We understand a little bit about, what it looks like in terms of Paralympic impact in terms of venues, volunteers, why do they volunteer? What are they doing at the games? What do they get out of the games? We know a little bit about sport participation and the fact that really there isn't as much impact as we would like or hope that there might be. And we know a little bit more about sort of the broader implications around governance and partnerships in terms of local level pieces. But I think what we do see is a pretty big gap in really understanding what impact the games and the Paralympic Games can have on cities, communities, and individuals. So I believe that is a big open piece, because I encourage researchers to really take up this effort and really start to understand that. I think we have a good community of scholars who has really begun to take up that effort, and we're learning more about athlete development, media and marketing, the communication strategies, broadcasting of the games, and the impact that has on local communities. And so I suspect in the years to come, we're going to know and understand a lot more about Paralympic legacy because we have more scholars working in that space. And I find that very encouraging. But at the current time, it's still in its infancy. So let's talk again in 5 years from now, Chris, and maybe we'll have a better understanding of Paralympic legacy.
Yes, hopefully in 5 to 10 years' time, we'll have a larger wealth of knowledge to draw upon about Paralympic legacy, and we can then have an even more in-depth discussion about legacy. Well, that's all we've got time for. It's been really interesting chatting with you today, Laura, about Paralympic legacies, and I thank you for your time. I hope you, listener, have learned more about Paralympic legacies following our discussion. Laura, it's been great talking to you, and I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Well, thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Associate Professor Laura Meisner there, talking about Paralympic legacies. So we now turn our attention, our final focus of this podcast, to the question of, is the Paralympic Games a source of empowerment or disempowerment for disabled people? To help us consider this question, I'm delighted to welcome Assistant Professor Dr. Danielle Peers to the show, who will be discussing the literature on empowerment potential of the Paralympic Games. Dr. Danielle Peers is a renowned expert in the field and is a former Paralympian herself, having represented Canada in wheelchair basketball, winning a bronze at the Athens Paralympics in 2004. Danielle, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining me today to discuss the empowerment potential of the Paralympic Games. I think it's fair to say the International Paralympic Committee is keen to push the idea of the Paralympics as having the ability to empower disabled people and to effect positive changes for disability in society. But there are some who question whether the Paralympics is really as empowering as the IPC and others suggest. So to start off, I and my listeners would be keen to understand, what do we mean by empowerment or disempowerment when discussing the Paralympic Games? And in what ways can the Paralympic Games empower or disempower disabled people?
When we think about empowerment, we kind of want to think about it at multiple levels. So on the one, we tend to conflate sometimes what's good for individual athletes, what's good for the collective of Paralympic athletes, and what's sort of good or empowering for disabled people in general. And so we're talking about empowerment at the individual level. I'd like to think about something like Foucault would call degrees of freedom. So one way to think about that is, what are sort of the range of choices an individual has in their life? What are the kinds of different ways that we can act, think, be as individuals? What's sort of our possible range? And so I think it is very possible at the individual level to think that particular Paralympic athletes are likely sometimes feeling empowered by their Paralympic journey. Right? It's very possible that they have new career opportunities opened, that people who may not have had opportunities to travel, for example, may have accessed it through parasport. The people who may have felt isolated in a small community may have met other disabled people and found potentially a disability consciousness through that, or a sense of community. So I don't want to take away the sort of ways that people's individual life chances may be bettered by their experience as an athlete. And I've experienced some of those things myself. But also, I think anytime you're dealing with elite sport, you're dealing with an incredibly disciplinary regime, right? I mean, as an athlete, and I think as a team athlete, I can speak to just how much of your life is controlled by that team, by the coaches, by the program, the things you're not allowed to do. 90% of your time is dictated by someone else. I have a kind of impairment that can be made worse by overexertion. And despite having agreements about what I would be doing based on what would not harm me long term, those were rarely recognized when a game needed to be won. There's just so many times where we get set up in a situation where it felt like, actually, as an athlete, my degrees of freedom when I was an athlete were incredibly limited. I didn't attend my grandma's funeral because I wasn't allowed to, go home from a tournament. Those are the things that kind of restrict also our choices. So I think at the individual level, we can talk some empowerment, some disempowerment. People can make those decisions. But I think what I'm more talking about is at a collective level. So when we think about the collective of Paralympic athletes, what I'm talking about when I think about empowerment is, to what degree do athletes have agency within their own lives in sports? To what degree do disabled athletes get to make decisions about what ball size they play with the rules of the game, with the kinds of structures they're playing within, with the classification systems and when those change, right? The kinds of the world of parasport around them, to what degree do they make changes? And this, of course, I'm drawing off of the larger disability rights movement when we talk about the difference between organizations for disabled people and organizations by disabled people, right? Where a bunch of people who are not disabled themselves have started organizations to quote unquote help disabled people. These are charities. The people who have full control and often are paid good money to run these organizations are actually not disabled people themselves. And there's some question whether these organizations actually increase the life chances and possibilities or empower in any way disabled people. And the Paralympic Committee has a long history, and I think continued history, of being an organization for disabled people and not by disabled people. And in fact, the leadership that gets heroized often about those who started the Paralympic movement and built it, people who get credit for that, often we're not giving credit to any disabled people, disabled athletes who, had a pretty significant role in the development of their sports. We erase them from history, but also they've often been pushed out, held out, actively fought against them being in positions of power within the Paralympic movement. So until the Paralympic movement basically has a requirement that at least 50% of the leadership are disabled, it will always be an organization for, and it will always be non-disabled people being paid and given and having the power to make decisions for disabled people who often don't have a lot of agency in their own lives in sports. And then the last question is basically, does the Paralympic movement empower disabled people in general? And I think on that level, it is a resounding no. I think the evidence is quite strong that the Paralympic movement, the support of a handful of elite athletes, has not, for the most part, increased the life chances of disabled people globally. And I think there's a good argument against, even within cities that have held the Paralympic Games, often hate crimes against disabled people have gone up. In the case of London, for example, Paralympic movement, IPC, has taken on sponsors that have created disability in massive numbers, and that have continued to oppress, and actually been organizations whose entire job is to oppress disabled people in many ways, if we take Atos as an example in the context of London. So I think I would argue a resounding no to the Paralympic movement being a force of good in disabled people's lives globally.
Some really interesting content there, Danielle. I think there's lots of avenues I'd like to explore. First of all, you have a strong conviction that the Paralympic Games isn't empowering for disabled people generally. I was wondering what evidence we have in the literature to support this view. Are you able to briefly discuss the evidence we have to support this position?
I've certainly written on this before, but if we look at even like some of the major sponsors for the London Games, we know that there were massive protests by disabled communities around two sponsors in particular. Atos, who at the time of funding the Paralympic Games and London putting a lot of money into it, was cutting disability supports for disabled people across England. There's certainly a lot of research articulating and giving evidence for leading to death and incredible lowering of life opportunities, life chances for thousands, if not more, of disabled people. And it was not only, Atos didn't only work in England, and you can see these same kinds of things happening now in Australia. So taking on sponsors whose essentially job it is to delimit the life chances of disabled people and allow states to not support disability rights is, I think, pretty atrocious. There's also taking on sponsors who were the culprits, who owned the companies who were in charge of the Bhopal massacre, which is a massacre that happened, a massive chemical incident that happened in India, and that caused incredible amounts of disability and also death in that community, and have never been properly supported or recognized. And again, the Paralympics have decided to keep these on. So I think there's a sort of pretty robust evidence about that they're taking money from and getting support from organizations who are definitely not in the business of bettering the lives of disabled people. But on a more global level, when we think about like how the Paralympics has in largely their relationship with the International Olympic Committee and their desire to create a sort of sellable Olympic Games, has diminished significantly the number of classifications, and this has not been evenly distributed. So the classifications that have been taken away are generally those that involve people who have more significant impairments, and certainly David Howe would be someone who has written more extensively on this than I have. But to the extent that like the IPC has had for years, and I would say decades, pushed out those with intellectual disabilities from the Paralympic Games and the Paralympic movement more generally, have really pushed against, I'd say, the vast majority of disabled people. So when we think about even who has a disability in the world context, the Paralympics serves an incredibly narrow percentage of that. And I think an increasingly narrowing percentage of the kinds of even impairment types, let alone we're sort of dealing with elite members of that group, and often members of the group who can afford expensive equipment. So it becomes kind of I would sort of argue, a freak show of a particular sellable form of disability. It sells the idea of inspiration and overcoming. And this idea is essentially that individuals can overcome any kind of barriers in their way to be successful. And the impact of that is that we're not actually looking at removing the barriers and the incredible kinds of violence, attitudinal problems, policy problems, architectural problems, a really significant difference and a really harmful one between this sort of, oh, look at these people who have all these resources, have often minimal impairments, single impairment types, very narrow range of impairment types. Look at how they can overcome everything disabled people can overcome. We don't need to give them supports. We can cut back on the kinds of accessibility initiatives we're doing because they can simply overcome. And in the end, that harms the vast majority of disabled people for whom our inaccessible, uncaring, and ableist societies harm on a daily basis.
Again, some really interesting content and multiple threads I'd like to explore if we had more time for this discussion. But unfortunately, we don't have enough time to talk about all of those things. I'm really interested in your discussion about the increasing marginalisation of athletes with severe impairments in the Paralympics, and you've explained why this is the case. I'd like to focus now on your thoughts about the marketing campaign in the UK by Channel 4 to promote the London 2012 and Rio 2016 Paralympic Games. For London, there was a strong focus on positioning Paralympians as superhumans, while for Rio, Channel 4 focused on the achievements of disabled people with a range of different impairments, focusing on the notion of yes, we can. Both marketing campaigns were praised, but there were also criticisms, particularly from some disability activists and commentators. Please can you explain your thoughts on these campaigns and also explain to our listeners what these criticisms were?
So I think the first thing I want to say is that I think there's a way to look at this, which is, are the Paralympics bad or good? Are they disempowering or are they empowering? I'm much more interested in the question, to what degree are the Paralympics and these particular campaigns useful and dangerous? And so it's much less helpful, I think, to try and categorize these things as sort of one thing or the other, right?
So trying to avoid binary classifications. Yeah,
and of course I do this work not because I want to throw all parasport under the bus. I actually think there's a big difference between are the Paralympic Games empowering and can parasport be, or disability sport be empowering? I think those are actually two entirely separate questions. Yeah, any more than the Olympics somehow represents all of sport, the non-disabled sport, right? There are all kinds of issues at the Olympic level. The big thing about these kinds of campaigns are, they drew a lot of interest. People were sort of excited about it, all this sort of thing. They may have drawn more people to the Paralympic Games. They may have been useful in these ways. But it's frustrating the degree to which people who are running these campaigns, there's been writing for 30, 40 years on things like inspiration porn, on things like super cripping, and the ways that this can be just incredibly harmful for most disabled people. What's really interesting about super narratives is that they do two things at the same time that seem oppositely to many things. But one thing they do is, by definition, they depoliticize, right? They focus on what bodies can do, and they don't focus on what the barriers are to people participating. And so this thing does two things at the same time. The first, it lowers expectations around disabled people. So this idea, if you look in the Superhumans video, you have people breaking world records and running, and in the very next shot, you have them brushing their own teeth. And in this weird way, it absolutely really diminishes the incredible athletic accomplishments that people are having, right? It's the same thing to break a world record as to brush one's own teeth. And so, it diminishes the actual achievements of people. It kind of lowers expectations in a weird way where it's sort of wow, you brushed your own teeth, which doesn't mean that and also that if one doesn't brush one's own teeth, somehow that has some sort of impact or statement on one's value, right? So again, independence here becomes the most important kind of value at the heart of this, which for a lot of disabled people, interdependence is actually the valued and supported way of living. So it depoliticizes, it lowers expectations, it actually diminishes our accomplishments in really significant ways, but it also sort of ties the valuation of disabled people to this idea that they can achieve and they will overcome these kind of barriers to achieve these to become Olympic athletes. And it means that people who do not do that, or who cannot do that, because of course this is structured around very limited ranges of disability, come to be blamed for their own dependence upon systems or dependence on with other people. So the Superhuman campaign is sort of almost the perfect example of all that, right? With jazzy music thrown in. Look at all the things that we can actually do. Amazing things, brushing our own teeth, teaching, and similar with it, yes, we can. I think this is sort of like a really, I think building again this idea that disabled people are incapable, and that the valuation comes when they can independently do things that are valued by non-disabled people, strikes me as a fundamental sort of, again, it would run counter to any kind of activist move that could ever possibly be made in the name of disability. And indeed, here's where we go back to empowerment, is any activist moves that have been done against the Olympics or Paralympic Games, against the Paralympic Games and the Paralympic movement, or even within the Paralympic movement, have been quickly squashed by the Paralympic movement, right? They're not actually interested in hearing what disabled activists have to say about how to empower disabled people, or what activists within the Paralympic movement have to say about how to make the Paralympic movement more accountable, more empowering, more affirming for disabled people.
For London 2012, for the first time in 32 years, the BBC were not broadcasting the Paralympics. Instead, it was Channel 4. And Channel 4 made a big effort to get as many eyeballs and as much focus on the coverage as possible. So when we're considering the Superhuman campaign, who are these adverts actually aimed at? Are these adverts targeted at non-disabled people, first and foremost, in order to get as many people watching the event as possible? And do you think there is an increasingly close relationship between the Olympic Games as an event and the Paralympic Games as an event? And if the Paralympic Games is moving closer towards the Olympic Games as an event, does this have an impact on the empowerment potential of the Paralympic Games, do you think?
Yeah, this is again where it's helpful to detach what is empowering for the Paralympic movement is potentially different than what's empowering for Paralympic athletes as a class, which is definitely different than what's empowering for disabled people, which is definitely, attached differently to what's empowering for particular disabled athletes, right? So were these campaigns good for empowering for the Paralympic movement? Yeah, probably. Yeah, they brought in money, they brought in all those things, right? Great for the Paralympic movement. But again, the Paralympic movement is not run by disabled people for the most part, right? Those are the people who are benefiting off of or from this kind of success. So it was great for, I would say, we have to think of the IPC, like the IOC, as a corporation. We need to think of it as something that is money driven, that's primary purpose. Olympics' primary purpose is not empowerment, right? The IOC and the IPC have banned activist articulations by athletes at the games. This is an organization that is, I think, foundationally against movements for social change, right? The world order, the corporations making billions of dollars. This is in the best interest of the Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee, and not in the best interest of most disabled people, the vast majority of disabled people. Certain Paralympians, particularly those who did well in London and were from the UK, I'm sure benefited greatly from the greater visibility. Again, that broadcasting did not broadcast all sports equally. Right? Those are particular kinds of athletes that were going to get access to that limelight and celebration. And so they may have been empowered by it, but that's actually quite a different thing to say. So the Paralympics, the metaphor I use is essentially, can you imagine a radical feminist organization that was really for empowerment of women selling calendars of porn to make money, right? Yeah, great. They made lots of money. They sold lots of calendars. Great. But they did it by throwing the kind of some significant principles. Now, porn can be great and can be empowering, but probably not the kind that's going to be used to sell it at a mass level. Yeah. So I think it's similar, right? We're going to use these things that disabled people and disabled activists have been very clear are harmful for the purpose of increasing the empowerment of a movement, which is not equatable to the empowerment of a people. And so I just think we need to keep those things separate. And when we talk about the IPC and the IPC is increasingly going to become this corporatized entity. It has always been led by non-disabled people. There have been some disabled leaders within it, but when we think about the kind of history, and I think the more aligned it becomes with the IOC, certainly some folks like Eli Wolf and stuff have argued the importance of no longer having two games. And you can just imagine what is going to be cut when if those two games were ever to merge. It's not going to be men's 100-meter wheelchair track. Let's put it that way. So increasingly, as it moves away from a participatory multi-disability model to a selling arm of the Olympics model, the more it is going to undermine any kind of funding of those kinds of other sports at a grassroots level. And that's what I care about. I actually don't care about what happens. I don't think the Olympics or Paralympics will ever be either forces or spaces of major social change. Any serious Olympic scholar will tell you the same thing, right? I mean, if you go to a scholarship on Olympic, there's a lot of, the critical scholarship is significant, right? There's a lot of critiques. All of those critiques of the Olympic model, committee, everything with the Olympics hold identically true about the Paralympics, right? Somehow we spare those scholars spare the Paralympics of the exact same critiques. And so I think we need to be really holding the Paralympics accountable in the way that we hold the Olympics. But the only reason that sports scholars haven't is because there's this sheen of they're empowering disabled people, that somehow the Olympics are about corporate interests and the Paralympics are somehow about social change. And I think that has to disappear. We have to hold them accountable and we have to critique them, because if there's any hope of the Paralympics becoming something that could actually be a positive force, then we need to do this work. And I think where my investments lie is that unfortunately these things trickle down. So the kinds of things that get funded in a country like Canada in terms of disability sport are those that go to the Paralympics. And they get funded more if they do well at the Paralympics. And so the kinds of changes that are incredibly ableist at that level trickle down to impact every disability sport opportunity that exists in our country. And I'm assuming many others as well. And so there's a celebration of this going to this model like the Olympics, like, will a Paralympians be paid the same amount for a medal as Olympians are? You know, and there's a celebration of that. And I think that is a terrible, yeah, great. The individual Paralympians, that's great. But increasingly imagining that disability sports intention is to gain medals at the Paralympic level is terrible. And I think it's terrible for the Olympics too. Why are we designing our entire sports systems around 0.1% of athletes?
You've already touched upon this point when answering some of the other questions that I've posed, but I was wondering if we could just focus specifically on the role of technology in Paralympic sports and whether that is a source of empowerment or disempowerment for disabled people.
When you come and you think about the sort of larger question of parasport, there are a couple other things going on. In some sports, by definition, it's going to be, things are going to be always won by the richest countries and by the richest athletes, right? That there are particular sports that in which if you cannot afford the incredibly expensive technology, and remember, some of this technology is trademarked, not everyone can access to it. You have this incredible divide that has already existed around parasport in terms of the kinds of funding people have for accessible infrastructure and things like that, that is just being multiplied by the kind of ways that technology drives capacity within specific sports, right? So that's at play. So it's definitely a force of inequity. So that's great. I mean, if you want to do this, then Paralympic committee should be using all these billions they're getting from corporations to equally fund each country to ensure that their top athletes have the same access to technology. I mean, like, if we think of this at a way of, if justice were in any way, if the discourse of justice empowerment that the Paralympic movement uses were in any way actually real, that would be the easiest possible policy to put into place, right? But of course they don't, because it was never about that. And then I think we have this sort of idea of like whether the technology is sexy, right? And so the selling of particular sports around this technology is really interesting. And one of the things I find most interesting about it, if you look at like the history books written on the Paralympics by non-disabled people, always you'll have this thing where you'll notice the only pictures are people that you can recognize as being disabled. So even when they use people with visual impairments, they'll only choose the sports where there's a specific blindfold being used or something. So people have to be made legible as disabled before they can be understood as sort of a Paralympic athlete. And so one of the bonuses of technology is it does this thing where it makes someone legible as disabled but in a way that can be sold and packaged in this sort of sexy way that a blindfold can't necessarily do, right? And so, yeah, I think it does these sort of two things that make it more sellable. If you were to look at, as Howe has articulated, like athletes with cerebral palsy, running, there's no technology. And if you just take a still shot, you can't necessarily, disability is not necessarily visible on bodies. And so that is not a sellable thing. And this is where my argument has been, at some degree, we're still using kind of freak show techniques where we want to heighten and in some ways exaggerate the visibility of disability to market on bodies to make it a gawkable kind of feature. So I think technology is not in itself a problem. But I think there's all kinds of ways that within the kinds of political structure and problems we're in, it's being leveraged in ways that increase the kinds of inequities and the maldistribution of opportunity and empowerment, as opposed to using it in ways that could potentially have the opposite effect.
It's been great chatting to you today, Danielle. It's been really interesting to learn more about the empowerment discussion. Lots of different topics have been covered. And I know I've learned a lot as a result of this discussion. I hope you, listener, have also taken some insights from our chat today. So all that's left for me to do is to say thank you, Danielle, for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been really interesting, like I said, and I really look forward to catching up with you soon. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Assistant Professor Dr. Danielle Peers there, who discussed the literature on empowerment potential of the Paralympic Games. That's it for today's podcast. Join me next time where I'll be discussing more academic knowledge on disability sport in our next Disability Sport Info show. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye. You've been listening to the Disability Sport Info show, academic insights into disability sport.